Okay, the final presentation in this session is from Dr. Goswami from InsightRX, where he's the co-founder and the CEO. It's my pleasure to welcome him. The title of the talk for Dr. Goswami today is The Evolution of Clinical Decision Support Tools that Enable Precision Dosing. Dr. Goswami.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sirj Goswami, and today I'm very excited to talk to you about the evolution of clinical decision support tools that enable model-informed precision dosing. I'd like to thank the FDA and the organizers for putting together such a timely, very informative panel. The talks so far have been terrific, and I hope that my presentation adds to the overall discussion. The other talks today have done a very nice job providing some incredible insights across the various important aspects of the precision dosing landscape, starting with the clinical need, some regulatory discussions, and even precision dosing in the context of drug development with adaptive clinical trials and biomarker-based dose finding studies. The perspective that I will provide is one of a product developer of a clinical decision support platform that enables precision dosing in the clinical setting. Once we have established the need for a particular drug, once there is a predictive model in place that correlates and links dose exposure response, how do we then translate that knowledge? What next? How do we get it embedded within the point of care? I want to quote Richard Peck actually earlier from his talk earlier. The concept of precision dosing need not be so frightening. So I hope that my particular presentation sheds light on the technology and implementation process and makes the whole process less frightening. As such, there'll be three key learning objectives for my presentation today. The first of which is to describe the current state of precision dosing tools and highlight some of the macro level factors that are enabling the broad adoption of clinical decision support platforms. My second objective will be to highlight approaches to overcome implementation challenges, and more specifically within the context of overcoming electronic health record integration barriers, and also how do we develop an optimal user experience. Finally, I will be talking about the importance of development beyond the clinical decision support tool by highlighting the importance of developing an analytics platform and framework to improve platform scalability and to demonstrate value. And what I mean here by the term scalability is basically the capability of the CDS tool to be implemented at multiple healthcare institutions with minimal operational burden. From our perspective, an ideal clinical decision support platform needs to be user-friendly, it needs to be scalable, integrated into the clinical workflow, and improve healthcare outcomes. The scope of my presentation today is going to be primarily focused on CDS tools that are implemented in the inpatient setting, so within the confines of the hospital. And because of time restriction, I will not be able to cover some of the other very important aspects of MIPD tool development, such as model development and model validation. So let's start with some history. In 1969, Lou Scheiner, one of the fathers of our field, pharmacometrics, wrote his hallmark paper titled Computer-Aided Long-Term Anticoagulation Therapy. In essence, the computer program described in this particular paper was the first ever clinical decision support tool for precision dosing. The program takes a simple compartmental response model to identify optimal future doses for patients on anticoagulation therapy. Scheiner showed that with our knowledge of pharmacometrics in 1969, that this was possible. 50 years after this hallmark publication, despite the clinical promise that Scheiner had showed, MIPD is still not widely used in the clinical setting today. If you look across the healthcare landscape, you might find that we've actually regressed a bit. There are many different dosing calculators, many different Excel spreadsheets. Some of these Excel spreadsheets rely on crude simplifications of pharmacokinetic models and typically don't leverage the power of MIPD. These tools are difficult to use. They require manual entry of patient characteristics, making it very prohibitive for clinicians to use. and in general lack the standardization required to improve the quality of patient care. Over the past, I want to say, decade, technological advancements and healthcare industry trends have set the stage for model-informed precision dosing. Health systems are now ready for several reasons, including the rise of electronic medical records, cloud-based computing, and the overall transition in the healthcare landscape from a fee-for-service type world to a value-based care world. For example, electronic health record systems, as denoted earlier, are adopted by over 96% of hospitals, and a lot of these systems are allowing their data to become more and more accessible. Clinical decision support platforms in other areas outside of the precision dosing space have evolved significantly due to these market and technology drivers. Improvements are being made across the spectrum of features required to develop a broadly adopted CDS platform, and some of these features are shown here. They include the development of an optimal user interface, showing clinical value, and continuously improving the implementation in clinical workflow. So I want to start off by talking about the importance of user interface and user experience within the context of MIPD. Historically, the healthcare industry has been troubled by poor product UI. Healthcare has lagged behind other industries, and it's helpful to understand why this is the case, because by understanding why, we might know what to do and what not to do when developing our own CDS tool. For one, EHR interfaces themselves are very old and very outdated, and have set the standard for user interface and design since the 90s. There are essentially two main EHR systems that you might have all been aware of, Epic and Cerner, and together they own a vast majority of the market share. And the problem is they were originally built in a fee-for-service type world, not a value-based care world. So they were originally built to manage claims and act as a hospital's financial system, less around clinical use. In addition to this, there are complicated clinical workflows in healthcare, and there are multiple stakeholders involved in the decision-making process. And these are important perspectives to take into consideration when designing an optimal user interface. A perfect example of this actually may be therapeutic drug monitoring, where you have a nurse, a clinical pharmacist, a physician, and even a lab all working in concert to administer a drug to a patient. CDS tools typically have to follow what's called a waterfall software design process. CDS tools are built under a quality management system type umbrella, and iterating or evolving the user interface is very challenging to do. If you've heard the term agile development, it doesn't really directly apply to the CDS space. There are many discordance issues in healthcare. For one, the clinical user might not be the hospital administrator who's buying the product. The software developer and the engineer are not the end users and typically not in tune with the clinical need. And there's a lot of complexity with respect to data inputs, data outputs, and an abundance of idiosyncratic terminologies, which has the potential of convoluting the user interface. So what do we do about this? How do we improve user interface and user experience in healthcare? Well, from a 30,000-foot view, the product has to fulfill three basic criteria. It has to be useful, it has to be user-friendly and intuitive, and also it has to be simple, at the same time not compromising on quality. And to do this effectively within the context of MIPD, it's very important to take into consideration two main viewpoints. The first of which is the expert point of view. The room is actually filled with them. These are domain experts in MIPD. These are clinical pharmacologists, could be clinical specialists. This individual brings a nuanced perspective of the field into a product design. And it's very important to have this perspective early on. However, it's very important to balance the expert point of view with the typical user point of view. The typical user represents the masses, probably not a domain expert, probably doesn't know too much about PK, PD, and model fits. This individual wants to be led in terms of the overall product experience. They prioritize ease of use. So in order to develop an effective user experience, we need to make sure that we take into consideration the expert point of view and the typical user point of view, and the product needs to be useful, user-friendly, and simple. So how do we do this? From a methodology standpoint, it's very important to conduct usability research studies early on, and also continuously learn, iterate the user interface based on feedback. So what we did initially is develop an initial prototype. We call this version 0. We incorporated the expert point of view into version 0. Our objective here was to make the concept real, right? We needed something that users can directly react to. We then proceeded to conduct qualitative research. But before we did this, we actually hired an external UI UX design firm to help us out. It was very important to get that third-party perspective into the equation, and also it helps having that perspective in order to minimize bias in terms of when you're actually designing the UI. In the research study, what we did is basically we had 2 different institutions. We tried to cover the spectrum of users from the expert point of view to the typical user, but with a primary focus on the typical user. We assessed user behavior during the studies. We administered user acceptance surveys, and the data and the insights that were gleaned from these particular studies were then translated into the product design. We work with the UI UX design firm. We developed mock-ups, frameworks. We merged observations from the studies with product UI heuristics. And once we came up with a final design, the final mock-up of what the CDS tool should actually look like, we then implemented that into the actual CDS tool. We then validated the direction that we were going based on additional user feedback and continuously improved the product design to this very day. So going from the development of initial prototype to the last stage here took us from version 0 to version 1. And I want to just briefly show you what version 1 looked like. Here's a screenshot. And at a high level, our objective here was to balance simplicity with showing relevant content. And there was a lot of information that we simply could not leave out, like the pharmacokinetic plot. At the same time, we had to make the dashboard somewhat customizable. So the perspective that you see here is designed for the clinical pharmacist, but we also have the capability of changing the user interface so that it matches expectations for a practicing physician. We also wanted to consolidate as much information as possible. Version 0 had about 4 different pages that users had to navigate. Here we have the patient characteristics, the dosing reference table with the predicted pharmacology metrics, and the biomarker table, all consolidated within one easy-to-use clinical workflow. An optimal interface is not sufficient to develop a scalable and usable solution. Right? One also has to carefully consider the clinical workflow of the end user. Doctors and pharmacists, as was highlighted earlier on, have plenty to do on a daily basis. They don't have time to manually input patient characteristics into an external tool. And secondly, they don't have time to navigate away from their current workflow. So if they're using a specific EHR system, it's very challenging for them to navigate away from that system. So integration within the clinical workflow is very important. And the software system that most hospitals use is an EHR type system, like Epic or Cerner or Allscripts. Why is integrating with these systems so challenging? EHR systems have traditionally been daunting electronic database systems that store patient information. They were originally built, as I mentioned earlier, to manage claims and act as a hospital's financial system. As a result, these systems are not built for clinical use. They're closed off, meaning they don't have good external APIs allowing patient data to be readily transferred. There are also many different standards and architectures for data exchange between the EHR and external tools like HL7, CCDA, FHIR, which is a more modern standard. And many of these standards require expert knowledge, and there's implementation specification variation between hospital to hospital. So hospital A may implement HL7 slightly differently than hospital B. Logistically, it is very challenging to integrate with EHR systems because they require scarce IT resources. There's probably a couple of engineers that work at the hospital. They probably have 10 or 15 different projects that they're working on simultaneously. It is very difficult to get up in the priority queue. And finally, clinical workflow within the EHR is not very clear. There is variation between the different EHR vendors, and there are different instances. So it's very important to understand and where the product is actually going to be residing within the EHR interface. So for these last 2 points here, we recommend that it's actually very important to work with a clinical champion at the institution. The clinical champion can help push the implementation process internally and also help us conceptualize where the product should actually be fitting into the overall workflow. Since I intend this presentation to be informative and didactic in nature, I've added quite a bit of detail here in this slide. Here you see the different integration approaches and the description along with the pros and cons of each method. And we've had experience with all of the methods shown here. And from our perspective, the first one, which is the custom integration approach, is probably the most time-consuming, the most challenging. Our first ever integration, which was a custom approach, took us about 8+ months to complete. And that's because IT staff, engineers at the institution have to be highly skilled. They have to develop their own custom APIs. And this just requires a lot of effort on behalf of the institution. And moreover, the implementation itself isn't transferable to other sites. You can't just take the code from one site and use it for a different site to get the integration done. The two most scalable methodologies shown here are the last 2 rows. The first is the EHR vendor app store type approach. And secondly, integration with third-party applications. I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into these 2 approaches. EHR vendors like Epic and Cerner and Allscripts and even Athena Health have more recently, I would say over the past 5 or 6 years, provided solutions modeled after the Apple App Store and the Google Play distribution service, where third parties can develop their applications and make them readily available for distribution. Some integration effort is still required by the hospital, though. It's not quite like the Apple App Store or the Google Play service, because engineers at the institution still have to spend some amount of time to make the integration live. The screenshot shows an integration with the Epic App Store, and from a user point of view, shown on the right-hand side, the clinical pharmacist can trigger the CDS tool directly from the electronic health record. The CDS tool is then embedded directly within the clinical workflow and inside the EHR system, and all of the biomarker data, the TDM data, dose administration data is automatically pulled, and an iframe is, as I showed here, embedded within the clinical workflow. Another approach that we think is probably the most scalable is an integration with third-party companies or applications. If an existing clinical application provider has already been readily distributed throughout the entire healthcare ecosystem, providing value to multiple stakeholders within that healthcare ecosystem, there is the possibility that you can leverage that integration network. You can leverage that, you can piggyback off of that distribution network. And the screenshot here to illustrate is a partnership that we have with a company called Premier. Premier is a large group purchasing organization. They have a product called Theradoc, which is a clinical surveillance product that's widely used today. And by integrating with Theradoc, right, all of the hospitals that are using Theradoc can now have direct access to the CDS tool without lifting a finger, without applying any engineering effort on behalf of the institution. The only difference here is from the user perspective. From the user point of view, the end user, whether it's a clinical pharmacist or a physician, is initially interacting with the clinical surveillance product. They're not interacting with the EHR system. But all of the information is automatically pulled, and the iframe is then embedded within that third-party application. With an optimal user interface and an integrated platform, there are still several important considerations that need to be addressed, not least of which is to demonstrate the value of the platform in an automated and very efficient manner. So over the next few slides, I will discuss the importance of creating an analytics framework to communicate clinical decision support value and to improve the future implementation process. Once the CDS tool has been implemented, there are still several pending questions that various stakeholders at the hospital may have. And the perspective may lead to different types of questions, whether it be for the chief medical officer all the way down to the physician. It could be questions like, what is the clinical benefit of using this tool? Will we save money by improving patient outcomes? What is the operational benefit to my organization? Is it creating a burden in terms of overall workflow? And even beyond the institution, on behalf of the drug product developer, it's important to understand how we can improve the implementation process at other institutions. So collecting the right data to help improve scalability. And also, how can we collect the right data required to demonstrate clinical value and identify, even downstream of that, the right predictors of drug response. So in order to answer these questions efficiently in a much more automated manner, it's very important to architect a framework that allows the proper collection of data, standardization of that data, and also a visualization component. So what we did is we created a system, as shown here, that batches the data from the CDS server on a nightly basis, strips all of the protected health information, pushes the data to a clinical analytics engine. Here, the data is processed, relevant operational and clinical metrics are derived, and the information in the visuals are pushed to a series of user-friendly dashboards. And the dashboards can then be looked at by the hospital administrator or the key stakeholder within the institution to answer some of the questions that we just talked about. Here are some example screenshots that a hospital administrator can view. On the top left, you see a pharmacokinetics dashboard to assess exposure target attainment, a clinical outcomes dashboard to investigate the incidence of various outcome-related events. And here you see the incidence of acute kidney injury. An operational dashboard which shows dose regimen utilization and also drug utilization overall, like which doses at which intervals were most often administered. And finally, a data exploration dashboard, which allows the end user to slice and dice the data and potentially even identify novel predictors that might impact PK, PD, and clinical response. To conclude, the three things that we went over today, developing an optimal user interface, integration into the clinical workflow, and developing an analytics framework to answer post-implementation questions, provide the basis for what the future of precision dosing has to offer. By laying this particular foundation, we will enable a future where patient-level learning with MIPD can be combined with population-level learning to improve treatment administration on a global scale. The scope here, of course, goes well beyond MIPD, well beyond PK/PD models, and into the scope of applying other predictive models and algorithms that ultimately impact and improve the clinical decision-making process. The hope here is that this type of closed-loop system, with the help of regulators, drug developers, healthcare practitioners, and even payers, will help us realize the full potential of MIPD that Shiner once had, and also create a mechanism to understand treatment response variation in the real world. With that, I want to thank you very much for your time and the FDA for the invitation. I also want to give a special thanks to my incredible team based in San Francisco, California. These are the individuals who deserve all of the credit for the progress that we've made so far in this field. With that, I want to thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Dr. Goswami. So we might have time for one question, and then we'll have a break for coffee.
My name is Charles Cornish, CEO of DoseMe, who works in the same space as Sirj and Insight. Sirj, one thing that wasn't, firstly, excellent presentation. One thing that we haven't spoken about is the appetite for hospitals to pay for clinical decision support software, where at the moment they're either using Excel spreadsheets and they compare that cost, which is essentially zero, or they've got a huge number of staff, as we've seen with the Cincinnati situation. So how do you balance that when it gets to the point to pay the bills?
Yeah, really good question. And there's a very long answer associated with that. At the bottom line is, if you can show clinical value, if you can show that an institution is actually saving money, there is a possibility that the provider can directly pay, right? But that said, it's very challenging and it's very drug specific. And evidence needs to be showed perhaps even prior to implementation of the CDS tool. I think downstream of that, there's a discussion that needs to be had in terms of shifting the cost burden from the provider to potentially the payer or even the pharmaceutical or biotech company that's actually manufacturing the drug. I think that would be a very deeper, much needed discussion given the fact that a lot of healthcare institutions find it challenging to pay. But at the same time, in a value-based care world where incentives are more aligned to improving clinical outcomes, the possibility will certainly be there. And I think that a deeper discussion needs to be had with respect to getting payers involved and drug manufacturers involved as well.
Great. So join me in thanking Dr. Goswami, and